Can you talk a little bit about the opposition that you all faced once you brought forward this proposal that is at least the seed of what was finally worked its way through the process? Who was in opposition? What were their concerns? And were you able to address those concerns as you moved through finalizing this idea?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to talk about the opposition because there weren't really groups in opposition. I don't think that anyone actually registered against the rule when they were lobbying.
Okay.
I think that some groups registered neutral if they were concerned about it.
Okay.
But one of the nice things that happened is that, I mean, we really listened to the point sources and took their concerns into account, and they took a shot at creating this, and we tweaked it to make it more compliant with the Clean Water Act and have a reasonable timeline. So the municipalities, the wastewater treatment plants, the paper mills, all of these groups were part of that discussion, and even though they think the timeline is really tight, they appreciate, I think, that it really takes into account their concerns.
Right.
It gives them flexibility to do this in the way that's fit for each watershed, and there's clarity. We always hear about uncertainty being something that makes businesses nervous. There's certainty about what accountability is going to be on. There's flexibility for them to reach that. So all of those point source groups, with the exception of the cheesemakers, I mean, Wisconsin's big on cheese, and the cheesemakers are in a difficult position where their very existence depends on farmers, and so they're somewhat concerned about how it would work for them. And a lot of cheesemakers are pretty small plants, so they're not sure that they could take on cleaning up a whole watershed.
Right.
And I'm hoping the way that will work out is that they can fit into bigger point sources, adaptive management plans, and play a role in it.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the point sources were actually pretty happy with this rule.
Okay.
And in some ways it changes, it's a new format for a rule, it's a new shape of a rule, and with it providing clear accountability and flexibility at the same time, I think that they like the structure of the rule. So there wasn't a lot of opposition. There was a lot of concern, and small point sources were concerned about how this would impact them. And some of them, testified about those concerns. But overall, people could see that this was really reasonable and that the concerns of point sources were really taken into account with it. So there wasn't a lot of opposition. As we implement it, if the farm groups are worried that there's going to be more regulation or more enforcement that comes out of it, we're going to face some resistance on that level.
Right.
But I'm optimistic that we can have a reasonable discussion about it, because it's not just going to be the environmentalists saying agriculture needs to clean up. It's going to be the environmentalists, the municipalities, the point sources saying, look, if agriculture doesn't clean up, we have this humongous expense we're going to be facing. So let's all work together.
Right. Bringing people together instead of the splitting apart strategy, it could actually bring people together in holistic solutions.
Yeah, I think one of the most frustrating things about the process was for 2 years going around and around, but I think that the listening part of it is something that we don't always take to heart. We take it for granted that we're listening to someone's side, and we lots of times think that we know it already, and so we're not really listening. But I think it took both sides really feeling like the other side had heard their concerns for us to come to this joint position.
I was going to summarize a little bit about what you said, and that's a great summary of it, I think, at its root. It sounds like, the list that I made as you were talking in my head was, that there was real engagement from all parties, and the time to do it, and like you say, not just sitting in the meeting, but listening through those 2 years, as painful as it could be, that even though you all ended up coming up, the environmental community came up with their own proposal, it was still, the seeds of it were listening to what the point sources had brought to the table, built off of that. And this idea of certainty as well. I've heard other people talk about that there's a certain amount of comfort in just knowing kind of where you all are headed, and where if you're looking at a big bill, that bill is going to means something in the end for those point sources in terms of compliance and in terms of improvements, even just to know that. So, but at root, the listening seems like core to this process, and that takes time.